Throughout The Legend of Zelda, countless items have aided Link on his quests. These items have improved his combat and movement options and created new scenarios for action and puzzle solving. Some of them have appeared in nearly every game since the very beginning, while others are still one-hit wonders. Today, I want to share my opinion on the top 10 items out of this multitude. Before we jump into the list, there are some criteria I have to set. First, I'm banning all the musical instruments from this list because they're too obvious and are really their own category of item at this point. I may even give them their own ranking in the future. Next, I'm generally not counting equipment like swords and shields, which I would also categorize as their own thing, even though they do occasionally appear on the same screen as other items. Other than that, anything is game. This is FP Productions, and here are my top 10 Legend of Zelda items. The whip first appeared in Spirit Tracks and was brought back in the very next game, Skyward Sword. In both titles, it's basically straight out of Indiana Jones. The whip allows Link to swing his way over large gaps, attack or at least fend off enemies, pull switches, and even snag treasure. In Spirit Tracks, it even allows him to hang from moving targets and has the ability to be used multiple times in a row without touching the ground. This makes it a simple multi-purpose tool that has a strong flair of adventure. I also like the controls. In Spirit Tracks, it's as simple as touching the screen, and it'll lock onto whatever you tap on. In Skyward Sword, the motion controls make it even more fun. Flicking the Wii Remote like an actual whip handle is immersive and adds a layer of directionality to it. The only downside to the whip is that a lot of its uses can be split up among other items. There are already a ton that can get Link across gaps or pull loot from enemies, and others outclass it offensively too. This means the whip can be a bit redundant, but it's still an item I wouldn't mind seeing again. Debuting in Skyward Sword, the Beetle is a surprisingly brilliant item that I've always enjoyed. Instead of being primarily a combat or movement tool, it's instead used more for scouting and gathering treasure. When Link launches the Beetle, he's able to see from its perspective, allowing the player to see far away or closed off areas. Even better, the Beetle brings back any treasure it touches along the way. This is really useful for seeing what's up ahead and finding hidden goodies. The Beetle is also used for puzzle solving. It can cut ropes, hit switches, and grab bombs, all of which have many applications throughout the game. Lowering bridges and blasting away far-off boulders are just a couple that spring to mind. On top of all that, the Beetle can get optional upgrades that allow it to fly for longer, take more hits before returning, and even kill small monsters. It's a simple tool that does a lot, and I'm surprised it hasn't been brought back already. Two of Link's handheld outings feature similar sand-related items. The Sand Wand appeared in the last main dungeon of Spirit Tracks, but despite its late arrival, it made a very strong impression. By touching the screen, you can draw a path on any sand surface that causes the sand to rise temporarily. This can get Link to higher ground, block projectiles, and tip over certain objects. All of these uses make for clever puzzles with tight timing, as well as one of the best boss fights in the game. The Sand Rod in A Link Between Worlds is similar enough to make it onto the same spot on this list, but is tweaked to fit that game's mechanics better. It still raises sand, but this time only in a straight line ahead of Link. This ties into his wall merging ability by giving Link new areas to merge from, and naturally has some pretty clever uses in the desert and its associated temple. However, between the two, the Spirit Tracks version is more notable overall. This item hasn't appeared in 3D yet, but I could easily see it being implemented in Breath of the Wild as a sand version of Cryonis. This could have made for some pretty interesting gameplay in the Gerudo Desert, especially in the Molduga fight, so I would love to see it appear in the sequel. Even though I doubt it'll happen, I really hope this item gets a chance to shine again in the future. The bombs are about as simple as it gets. They blow stuff up, and that's it. What they lack in uniqueness, however, they make up for in usefulness. Bombs have appeared in every single game except Adventure of Link, and it's hard to imagine the series without them. From the first game onward, they've revealed hidden caves filled with treasure, cleared away roadblocks, and exploded some Dodongo's intestines. They've seen very few tweaks over the years, and that's because none have really been needed. The water bombs in Twilight Princess and the square bombs in Breath of the Wild are welcome additions, but I don't think much more is needed. The bombs have a clear but essential purpose and stick to it, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The bow is another simple item. You take aim and shoot enemies. There's generally nothing fancy going on. It's a projectile attack and can also hit switches. It's not on this list for uniqueness, but for being a staple part of Link's toolkit in almost every single game, and for good reason. A fantasy adventure game just wouldn't feel the same without a bow and arrows, and having a ranged attack is only natural. Nintendo has also found some ways to spice the bow up here and there. Ocarina of Time introduced fire, ice, and light arrows, which have their own uses in given situations. Fire arrows can light torches and burn away spiderwebs, ice arrows can freeze enemies, and light arrows are extremely powerful but take a huge chunk of magic. Twilight Princess lacked the elemental arrows, but introduced the equally useful bomb arrows, which can explode obstacles or enemies from afar. Finally, Breath of the Wild added slow motion firing, which is extremely fun and lets you deal out multiple hits in a pinch. Overall, the bow is an essential tool in any game it appears in. I'm not sure what it is about items that start with the letters B-O, but the boomerang completes the trifecta. Appearing with the bow and bombs in the first Zelda game, it's been just as essential over the years. In the early games, where enemies are at their most punishing, being able to stun them with a simple toss of a boomerang is massively useful. I can't imagine getting through Zelda 1 or even A Link to the Past without it. It's not quite as strong offensively in later games, but makes up for that with puzzle-solving utility. In Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, it could target multiple objects at once in a specific order, and the Twilight Princess version even had a wind effect that could put out torches. In the DS games, you could draw a specific path for the boomerang, which was not only satisfying on its own, but also gave it more puzzle applications. And of course, it's always had the ability to bring back hearts and rupees from a distance, which is also very useful. The boomerang has been a trusty tool from the very beginning, and I hope it keeps on flying back. The spinner is a unique item that so far has appeared only in Twilight Princess, but that's a shame considering how much fun it is. The item lets Link ride along a certain type of track on the sides of walls, which opens up previously inaccessible locations. Zipping up the sides of a large room and jumping from track to track feels like a miniature roller coaster ride, and is used to epic effect in the Skyward fight. That's basically it, but despite its niche use, the spinner has always stood out. Its main weakness is that it isn't used more. Aside from a few spots in later dungeons and the overworld, the spinner virtually vanishes after the Arbiter's grounds. The fact that it leaves such an impression in its short time in the spotlight just goes to show how much fun it is. Though Breath of the Wild could have used more runes, the ones that were there were all very fun and useful. Of the bunch, I found Magnesis to be the most fun and useful. With the ability to lift and freely move metal objects, the Magnesis rune can be used in a whole host of situations and stays relevant throughout the entire game. Want to sneak up on enemies and damage them without breaking your stuff? You can do that. Want to cross a river or a pool of lava? Magnesis has you covered. Don't have enough stamina to make a steep climb? No worries, Magnesis can do it all. That's just scratching the surface too. You can position metal blocks to conduct electricity, or pull metal treasure chests to you, or drop objects onto a narrow plank to catapult yourself. Oh, and how can I forget the crazy flying machine that I have not even managed to pull off yet? The Rune is such an integral part of Breath of the Wild that it easily made its way onto my list, and I hope to see it return in the sequel and beyond. The Deku Leaf appears early on in The Wind Waker and stays relevant throughout the entire game, giving Link the ability to glide through the air. Needless to say, this is highly useful and an essential tool for exploration. Just like Breath of the Wild's paraglider, the Deku Leaf makes getting around much easier and can be used to reach otherwise inaccessible areas. And on top of that, the simple joy of gliding above the wide blue sea can't be overstated. On top of that, it has additional use beyond the paraglider. Using it on the ground turns it into a large fan of sorts that sends out a gust of wind. This wind can push objects, move platforms, or occasionally stun small enemies. The game finds quite a few puzzles to tie into this ability, making the Deku Leaf an all-around fun and useful item in various situations. At the top of my list is another straightforward movement tool. From A Link to the Past onward, the hookshot and its many variations have pulled Link across gaps and up to higher platforms, opening up many new areas to explore and treasure chests to open. Whatever it is about these simple items, they have me hooked, no pun intended. The hookshot has seen some interesting tweaks over the years. In A Link to the Past, it could latch onto basically anything, but in its first few 3D appearances, it was limited to only wooden surfaces. Then, in Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, its cousin the clawshot was further limited to grab only a certain type of target. However, those games made up for it with the brilliant addition of a second clawshot, which turned Link into a medieval Spider-Man. Launching from target to target is one of the most fun things in any Zelda game, period. There's also a fascinating version in Oracle of Ages, the Switch Hook. This take on the item lets Link swap places with certain objects, which is more of a game changer than it sounds like. In addition to simply letting Link reach new places, the added aspect of moving things around makes for some tricky switch pressing puzzles. It was actually a genius twist on the usual item, and I wouldn't mind seeing it again. At the end of the day, the hookshot is a fun item even in its simplest form, and its more creative versions are enough to pull it to my #1 spot on the list. Well, that concludes my list of the top 10 Legend of Zelda items. For my newer subscribers, I'm sorry this took so long to get done. I've been really busy and needed a little break, but I plan to do one video a week again. For anyone who made it this far, I'd love to hear your favorite items as well, and any thoughts you may have on my choices. This is FP Productions, and I'll see you next time.